So today's readings kind of a little bit hard, don't you think? And I mean, it is the first Sunday of Lent, so we kind of expect hard readings to open that hardness that is the season of Lent. They're hard readings about the reality of human sin and our own need for rescue, for salvation from God. Now, lots of people have said that Episcopalians have a hard time talking about sin. It's not one of our favorite topics, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
But the thing is, our Book of Common Prayer has no problem with the topic. If you open up to the Catechism, raise your hands if you've ever looked at the Catechism in the Book of Common. All right, hey, excellent. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's got some if you want those easy, well drawn out definitions of things that you've always wondered about, it's the place. Anyway, if you look at the category, what is sin? The answer is, sin is the seeking of our own will instead of God's will, and thus distorting our relationship with God, our relationship with other people, and our relationship with the whole of creation. Seeking our will, doing what we want instead of what serves the needs of God's love for God, for each other, and for the whole of the planet. Makes sense, right? Seems pretty straightforward, and yet, I don't know why, but we still don't want to talk about it. We like to joke about it, that's for sure. I mean, think about all those little temptations that we face that we put really great names on, like triple fudge chocolate sin cake. And who's going to resist that, really? Delicious. But it's not like we can hope to avoid some temptation, hence putting the name on chocolate cake. I mean, what we discovered today is that even Jesus could not avoid that very human experience. It's that we want to get through it, just like Jesus did, without ever succumbing, without ever sinning. That's the way we would like it to play out for us. But the truth is that sometimes we manage that, and sometimes we don't. So it seems like we may as well talk about sin. So here we go. Today's readings begin with the story of perhaps the most infamous couple in all of history, Adam and Eve, and the story of what is sometimes thought of as the first sin ever. Now, Adam and Eve have a great backstory because they were formed by God's very hands. He scooped up the earth and lifeless dirt. He mixed it with water, kind of like, you make Play-Doh, and he lovingly molded it and shaped it into humans. And then God breathed God's very own breath into them, and they had life. Their life, their existence, everything sprung out of God's love for this creation. But that wasn't all, because God made them caretakers of a beautiful and bountiful garden. God met all of their needs, and you know what? They still managed to mess it up. Which, that's very human, right? They are not the first or the last people to, completely ruin a good thing when they have it. But can you blame them? I mean, God says, you can eat anything but this tree right here, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Big mistake.
I mean, we know what's going to happen. Even if we hadn't read it before, of course, they want to eat the tree. Even without that crafty serpent coming along and egging Eve on, I have a feeling that there's no way that any human ever created could have resisted that very temptation. So, of course, they eat the fruit, and everything changes. Instead of being blessed, they are cursed, and they trade their intimacy and simple dependence on God with the struggle of human life and death. Now, there has been all kinds of conversation and controversy about this story. Starts way back in ancient Judaism. There's tons of writing to try to figure it out and its meaning. All through Christian history, we have also been talking about it. There's so many interpretations, going right back to that reading from Paul that we heard today, which is probably one of the earliest pieces of Christian biblical exegesis that we have. We love to argue over this one, whether it's historical or allegorical, and people have put all kinds of things on the table, like Augustine. He even tried to make it women's fault, which we know is not the case. They were in it together. But as much as we hate to admit it, this story, it is our story. It is our human story. It's full of truth about us and about human existence. It is a story that manages to capture and define our relationship with God. It captures God's intention for intimacy, and our tendency to run away from that offer of total love. Now, framed as it is in this kind of mythological language, it makes it seem very arbitrary and unfair that somehow not listening to God leads to alienation from God. But we know how this truth plays out in our own relationships. I mean, ask any married couple. I know there's a bunch of you in the room. And I'm sure that anyone would tell you that there has been many an argument that has sprung from one or the other member of the partnership failing to listen to the other, right? It's true, right? It's true for Matthew and I. Yet individuals and whole peoples forget that truth over and over again. We're not that different from Adam and Eve. Sometimes we choose to follow our own voice, choose our own needs, without taking the time to listen and honor the voices of the people around us who are part of our intimate, closest family relationships and the communities and the world that we're a part of. This story also likes to remind us that however we might have come by it, we do in fact possess the knowledge of good and evil. We know about right and wrong. We have free will and conscience. It's a great, incredible power and blessing that has been given to us by God. It's also a great temptation. Paul, in his reading today, loves to remind us of what we just are dying to forget. That it's not just Adam, all of us mess this up all the time, all of us sin. Because Adam and Eve, they're not the only ones that wonder what it's like to have God's power, right? Think about it. This story is a story about the human inclination to want to play God, or to at least kind of attempt to grasp at that great power that we imagine is what it's like to be divine. And of course, the tragic consequences that come from that. Think about all of the real choices over life and death that we have in our world today. I mean, in medicine, we've developed the need to ask when life starts and when it ends, and how we create it with dignity and whether we can choose to end it with dignity. And we developed all of that power to do that, even when we haven't quite figured out how to satisfactorily answer those questions. Think about all the peoples across human history that have set out to conquer the world. Only ultimately, they fail over and over again. And what they leave in their trail is generations of killing or oppression in the process. I mean, it goes right back to the Egyptians, the Persians, the Assyrians. That's all there in the Bible. The Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans. But it's not just ancient times. I mean, we can keep going. The Ottoman Empire, the Chinese imperial dynasties, the European colonial powers, 20th century, the Nazis, the fascists, the communists. I mean, history's just littered with that very story. And it's not over either. I mean, in global politics today, we have the same kinds of games taking place. I remember growing up in the 80s under the fear that the world could be destroyed by a nuclear war. And we spent a lot of the early 21st century being afraid about all kinds of terrorism. We worried about us and others and people we didn't understand. And these days, there's different types of global powers in control. Tech companies like Facebook, Twitter, Apple, Amazon, you know the list, who possess an incredible hegemony and power, almost like gods. And there is a huge human cost to that too, we're discovering. And I'm sad to have to say that only this week we marked the solemn one-year anniversary since Russia invaded Ukraine. There's been so many lives lost, and there's no end to this war in sight. It's our human story. Humans try to play God, and it costs us. We don't seem to learn. But what Paul is telling us is that we have another story today too. Because Paul is reminding us that Jesus' story is also our human story, but it has a different ending for us all. That story of the temptations in the wilderness that we hear in our gospel is about Jesus refusing serve your own needs and comforts. But Jesus refuses to play this game 3 times. It's in this gospel story that we learn that playing God in the way that humans think of it, it's not striving after God's power. It is actually striving after Satan's power. It becomes clear why so much tragedy then, so much human suffering is what results from this game, isn't it? It's here also that Jesus shows us another way. Jesus reveals to us God's way, God's power. Because what Jesus shows us is the power to put aside things like self-aggrandizement and self-serving, meeting your own needs first, and to instead place that word of love in the center of it all, so that the needs of that love from God played out in how we love our neighbor, how we love our community, how we love all of creation is what becomes the center of it all. It's clear from today's readings that sin and temptation, they are real for us. That's the truth of Adam and Eve's story. We know good from evil. But it's also true from the story of the temptations of the wilderness that Jesus shows us himself to be just what Paul has declared him to be, a bridge. A bridge to help us cross between that very human failing and to reclaim what was our original blessing. We can be led astray by the crafty serpent, but we also make right choices all the time, and it is by God's grace that God is in that struggle with us. Jesus is there as our bridge, just like the Holy Spirit was with Jesus in the wilderness. So, back to Lent. Here we are, beginning of Lent. And I think part of why we have the celebration each year, we spend 5 weeks on it, basically, is so that we can avoid the temptation to not talk about sin. Right? So, guess what? We're going to keep talking about it for the rest of the season. There is a televangelist that was famous for saying he was just going to skip Lent because he thought it was such a downer.
Oh my gosh.
And I have to say, sometimes I'm tempted to skip it too. But we need it. We need this humbling reminder of the reason for our need for salvation. It's a journey towards Easter. It's important. Because you know what? Easter makes no sense if we don't realize how important Jesus coming to live with us, show us the way, walk through the end of our path of human suffering, and then have the end of the story not be death, but new life with God. We need all of that, and we need time to work on that and figure it out and to be reminded of it. The consequences of death are not the end of our story, because Jesus died for us. Lent's here to help us to keep all of that into perspective. We begin with all these stories about sin and temptation, but we also began on Ash Wednesday. And Ash Wednesday takes us to the real beginning point, because the first thing we did before we did anything else in Lent is we were forgiven. We were forgiven. And that's the real root of this story, is that we have already been recipients of God's love and grace. God is already with us all the time, helping us to transform and to reconnect and to live out of that original blessing, so that we love God, we love each other, and we love the whole of creation. So we're forgiven before we even get to this Sunday full of sin talk. And God never forgets that inner truth. We're not gods, even though sometimes we strive to be, but we are the bearers of that original blessing from God, that life breath that filled us. And God has never forgotten it, and God's strategy from day one to keep us connected was the bridge, Jesus. So that's our journey that I invite you into as we walk through these 40 days and then celebrate Christ's resurrection on Easter. Amen.